3, 2.
Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Dr. Suzanne Lemenestrel, and I'm the Director of Science Affairs at the Society for Research in Child Development. And welcome to our Meet the Editors webinar. We're really thrilled to be hosting this webinar today. SRCD's mission is to advance the developmental sciences and promote the use of developmental research to improve human lives. And we publish 4 scholarly publications, including Child Development Perspectives, Monographs of the Society for Research in Child Development, and Social Policy Report. We'd like to take this time today to introduce you to the editors of all 4 publications. And we thank you for attending, and we hope you find today's webinar informative and that it answers some of the questions you may have regarding submissions to the publications and where the editors see the future of their publications. So we want to ask you to please complete the brief evaluation survey that will be sent to you immediately after the webinar. Next, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Ching Chow. Dr. Chow is a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research focuses on cultural, family, and temperament influences on children's executive function, socio-emotional, and academic development from preschool age to young adulthood. She has served on the editorial board of Child Development, Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, and the British Journal of Developmental Psychology, and is currently an associate editor of Developmental Psychology. Cheng is also the co-chair of SRCD's publication committee. So welcome, Cheng, and thank you so much for moderating today.
Thank you, Suzanne, for the introduction, and thank you all for attending the webinar today. I will introduce the editors to you today and then turn it over to each of them to share their publications with you. The chat is open and will be monitored, so please feel free to pose questions. We also solicited questions from the registrant ahead of today's webinar. So thank you to those of you who have submitted your questions. At the end of each editor's presentation, we'll have time to address some of the questions. So let's get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Shauna M. Cooper, our Interim Editor of Child Development. Dr. Cooper is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's also a faculty fellow at UNC Frankfurter Child Development Institute, the Center for Faculty Excellence, and a faculty affiliate of the Carolina Consortium on Human Development. Dr. Cooper's research focused on the social and cultural context of development, with an emphasis on family and communication factors. Dr. Cooper brings a range of experience in scientific editing, including serving as an associate editor for child development, on the editorial board member for several developmental science, psychology, and multidisciplinary journals. And she has been a reviewer for a number of peer-reviewed journals and funding agencies. And Dr. Cooper has held numerous leadership and advisory roles at UNC Chapel Hill and at the national level. And she has been an active member of the our SRCD organization for over 20 years. So let's hear from Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, and good morning to all joining us on the webinar today. I wanted to first give an overview of my vision for child development, as well as some key points about the journal. And my hope is that this overview will be an anchor for follow-up questions and the Q&A. So broadly, child development traditionally has considered papers that span various disciplines and areas. However, the focus of many of those papers, or all of those papers often, is that it informs some understanding of development and our developmental processes and developmental science more broadly. So our published papers reflect a range of topics. Often reflecting high impact and work that we consider innovative and a contribution to science more broadly. My goal as interim editor is to continue to reflect and highlight this range, really thinking about work that speaks to the various theoretical perspectives, diversity of context, and methodological approaches, as well as highlight emerging areas of developmental science. And so thinking about my vision, I wanted to briefly sort of share the structure of child development, because I think that structure is really, really key for actualizing that goal. So our editorial board reflects this approach. We have 20 associate editors who bring expertise from several areas related to developmental science. And child development has over 120, probably quite a bit more, given we've added some new consulting editors who are both topical experts as well as methodological experts. And so that broad approach, I think, is key for reflecting the diversity of work that is occurring within the field of developmental science. Very briefly, I will highlight the types of papers that child development publishes. We publish empirical articles, which are usually 40 pages or less. Some of those go beyond that. Brief empirical reports, which are a format that is 4,000 words or less, which is typically meant for work that is considered cutting edge and or presenting novel or new findings and or new methods. We also published reviews, and so there is some flexibility. Traditionally, reviews are have been more synthetic in nature. So often, child development often publishes meta-analysis and or other systematic reviews. I think that there is also space for reviews that are focused on emerging topical areas. Also, child development often considers commentaries in response to published papers. And then special sections, and I'll go, hopefully we'll have time to go in detail, but routinely child development publishes special sections, which is often a set of anywhere from 6 to 8 papers, sometimes more, sometimes less, that are focused on a broad area, intersecting area. Also, in late 2023, child development will begin to consider registered reports for publication. And this is outside the upcoming special section that will be out later this year as well. So with that said, I want to make sure that it's clear to all of you on the call today that although we have these, what we consider general formats, I think that there is space for submissions outside of these formats in terms of their the novelty and the potential impact of this submission. So I will end there and then hopefully pick back up on some of these key points in the Q&A.
Thank you, Shauna. We got a number of questions from our audience. One of the things when it comes to submitting your paper for publication is to finding the right fit for the journal. So a question that folks have is what type of papers, what type of studies would be a good fit for child development? For example, would CD consider qualitative and mixed method work? And if the author is not sure whether it's a good fit, how can they ask you about the fit of their particular submission?
So I will try to give the abridged version of an answer to this question. I think the approach that I've been taking is really to think about whether or not this paper, this study, this group of studies informs our understanding of development more broadly. And I say it in that way because I think there is flexibility in what fit may mean to you as a submitting author. And I think my role is to give space for that work to be considered and exist within child development. So with that said, I give a couple of points around what might be a good fit. I think developmental framing is clear. I use an example of the distinction between papers that are clearly framed in a way that will inform developmental science versus papers that may also go to a more medical journal, right? So that framing is different. And so I think up front, in terms of assessing fit, is really to make sure that developmental framing is key. Also, I think, and again, this is dependent upon your area and the work the area of the work that you're submitting, but that findings are novel and represent a contribution. I think beyond that, what is key is that contribution and that novelty is communicated within the manuscript itself. I think submitting authors often estimate that in the pages, and I would encourage all of you, as you are thinking about submitting, to really articulate in the manuscript how the methods, how the findings, how the perspectives are a contribution and extend existing work. Also, I will say is, thinking about methodology as it is aligned and linked to your study rationale. I think I get this question a lot, so I will quickly, and I see a question that I hopefully will answer with this response. But child development traditionally and currently publishes papers that use a range of methods and design. So whether that is experimental work, observational, survey-based. Of course, we publish work that is multi-wave and multi-reporter. Those of you who are quite familiar with the journal also will note that we publish studies that use cross-sectional data. And so I think those are some of the explicit questions that I often receive. I see one of the questions around qualitative and mixed methods work. And so I'll go in and answer this question with this response, and that, yes, we publish qualitative and mixed methods work. I think really the question is the novelty and contribution of the work, and how the method helps us extend our knowledge of what we know regarding this particular area and our topic. I will also say is that we have also extended our statistical CEs to include those with qualitative methodological expertise, which I think is important, right? So that is a clear indicator that we want that work to be highlighted in child development, and to go to the experts who should review that work. So hopefully that answers the question. But I will say is that one of the best ways to assess fit, and I get emails all of the time, so keep them coming, around whether or not your paper is a fit for child development. And so I'm always happy to receive and respond those emails. Oftentimes people will send a abstract or description of the paper. Sometimes, so there are various ways. And so we have a lot of follow-up discussions that are often around fit, things that are important for framing, and will help move this paper forward to be under review or under consideration for child development. So hopefully that answers the questions, and feel free to follow up in the Q&A.
Yeah. And one question is, as an author, if it's my first time submitting to child development, what's the process going to look like for submission?
So another abridged response in the time that I have. But I will say this first and foremost is that there's often variation, and it depends on a host of factors. I will say is that we try to take a very streamlined approach to our submissions. And so the goal is that I will have if there is a desk rejection, I try to do that within 5 days or less. Sometimes that will come in 2 days, sometimes that will come in 5 days or 6 days. And again, that is really to make sure that if it isn't a fit for child development, is that you have an ample time to be able to submit it elsewhere. And then for papers that are moved on, those papers are then forwarded to AEs who are experts in the areas of that potential manuscript. Do know that AEs also can practice their editorial autonomy and can desk reject a manuscript and or choose to send it out for review. I think broadly, child development, we aim to have our first decision within 60 days. I will be completely honest and upfront that reviewer challenges during the pandemic have continued to stress the timeline. And so sometimes your decision will come back in 45 days or 60 days, sometimes, 70 days. And so some of that is making sure that the experts that need to review that work have the opportunity to review that work. I think a couple of just follow-up things is really thinking about if a paper is not a candidate or not a fit for child development, we have the Wiley Developmental Science Network referral network. And so often papers that I think are really great papers, but may not be a fit for child development, I will refer to journals who are in our network. So that's the Journal of Research in Adolescence, Mind, Brain, and Education, as well as a host of other developmental science, a host of other journals. And so I do take the time to read those manuscripts to make sure that they are fit for our journal, but also to assess what other journals in our network may be a good fit. And so again, I'll stop there and can pick back on some of those things later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. And now I would like to introduce you to Dr. Rebecca M. White. She's the Interim Director of Child Development Perspective. Dr. White is the Professor of Family and Human Development in the T. Denny Sanford School of Social and Family Dynamics at Arizona State University. It's an interdisciplinary unit that incorporates an expansive view of children, youth, and families. Dr. White has served on several editorial boards, including Child Development, the Journal Research on Adolescence, Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, Adolescent Research Review. Dr. White has a long history of serving SRCD, including she served as a twice elected secretary of the Latinx Caucus and as a member of the Ethnic and Racial Issues Committee. Dr. White has published more than 60 peer-reviewed journals, articles, and made invited contribution to numerous editors and volumes. And let's hear from Dr. White.
Thank you, Ching. Thank you all for being here today. And thanks, Shauna, for doing such a good job of orienting us to child development. Relative to that, I'd like to start by giving you all a brief overview of the way that CDP, or Child Development Perspectives, is unique from Child Development and other SRCD journals. So CDP, or Child Development Perspectives, emphasizes brief, well-synthesized reviews of research, typically focusing on emerging or novel lines of inquiry in the developmental sciences. The journal also sometimes publishes essays on policy, stats and methods, and other topics suitable for the readership. These articles are short, about 3,250 words. Just by comparison, and Shauna, I'm not saying this is the word limit in child development. Please don't, I'm not trying to speak for child development, but a typical child development article is probably around 10,000 words. And a CDP article is limited to 3,250. So that's a real big difference there. Again, CDP focuses on reviews of emerging or novel lines of inquiry in the developmental sciences. So any types of reports involving primary or secondary data and analysis are not appropriate for CDP. They'll be desk rejected. Another way that CDP is a little bit unique from child development and other SRCD journals is that a substantial proportion of CDP articles are invited submissions. And invited submissions can typically happen in one of two ways. First, and this is the more common way, an author can send me a brief proposal, usually an abstract length proposal of a paper that they want to write or they are working on that they think may be a good fit for child development perspectives. I review these proposals and I usually engage with the authors around the topics a little bit. For example, and I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the ways that I engage with potential authors in making sure that the work is a good fit for CDP. So usually those brief proposals come, the authors and I have a couple emails back and forth about fit and framing, and then that may result in an invitation from me. That's one of the primary ways. Now, I've also received authors writing me saying, you know, dear Dr. White, I would like to write a review article on peers. What do you think? That's really inadequate. I can't tell what is new or emerging about what the review that they want to do. I can't evaluate it relative to what's recently been in the journal or what is already invited, what already invited pieces are. So abstract length, something that really gives me an idea of what's new and emerging, what is the developmental framing, that's what's really helpful for proposals for me. So again, a majority of CDP submissions are invited. That can happen because somebody sends me a proposal, we engage with one another, and then I give them an invitation. A second way that an invitation can happen is that I'm monitoring trends in the developmental sciences and reaching out to collaborate with other special interest areas in the developmental sciences to reach out to potential authors and experts in various topics on my own. So I would reach out to somebody and say, I know you're working in this emerging line of inquiry and that you're a leader in this area. And I think that, you know, what the type of work that you're doing and a review for CDP would be really good for CDP readers in the developmental sciences. And so invitation can also happen that way. Some ways that I generate ideas about that content, for example, reaching out to the caucuses and saying, hey, you all are experts in these various areas. What are emerging topics in your field that, you know, may be good conversation in child development perspectives? So those are invitations, and those are the two primary ways that invitations happen. And then a smaller proportion of CDP articles are unsolicited, meaning the editor does not invite them. And what's important to note is that in truth, anyone can submit to CDP at any time. And so these latter submissions are what we call author-initiated submissions. And that person hasn't necessarily reached out to me before, their work just shows up in my editor inbox. That's fine, that's perfectly permissible. I do think the conversation via the proposal process will help you anticipate some needs and expectations of CDP reviewers, but you are certainly welcome to submit to CDP by an author-initiated submission at any time. Both author-initiated submissions and invited submissions go through double-blind peer review, and that does not affect that process as long as the pieces make it past desk rejection. And then all except one of the final differences between CDP and other journals at SRCD, and in particular child development, is that all accepted articles go through sometimes quite extensive copy editing after acceptance. And the point of this copy editing is to work with a professional editor to increase accessibility of the articles and the science to a wide audience of end users. And so those are some of the primary ways I wanted to talk about the ways that child development perspectives is different from other journals at SRCD.
Thank you, Dr. White. One question we have is, what are some common missteps when it comes to submitting to CDP? Like the papers you desk rejected, what do you see as a common, reasons? Right. Are there any common patterns of misfit?
Yes, thank you, Ching. So desk rejections, actual desk rejections, the most common reason for that is that somebody has submitted an empirical paper to CDP, and CDP is just not a home for primary or secondary empiricism. So that is one of the most, and those are always author initiated submissions. I don't invite empirical contributions. And it's just a matter of the authors not having noticed or perhaps read the aims and scope carefully to understand that CDP is not a home for empirical work. The next three things that aren't necessarily, they don't always lead to desk rejection, although they certainly can. But these, as I started to take on the role of interim editor, I started compiling sort of a list of what were common things that were happening in the review process. And so now when I start to engage with potential authors around CDP, I actually just send this list out very early on. And this list starts with, does the work review a novel and emerging topic of interest to developmental scientists, practitioners, and our policymakers? If there's nothing novel and emerging about it, you know, it's the reviewers, CDP reviewers are going to be unhappy. And, you know, I always, when I'm working with trainees, I'm like, we always want our reviewers happy while they're reading our paper. We don't want them unhappy while they're reading their paper. And so I think what happens is reviewers get excited to see a piece, you know, being considered at CDP on a topic that they're interested in. But if the topic, if the review doesn't have a novel and emerging component, they get very disappointed. And I understand that. That's an aspect of fit for CDP. And so I always encourage people to really review the scope and aims. And then I say, you know, if the work is addressing an emerging or novel line of inquiry in the developmental sciences, then CDP may be a good fit for the work. And this is sort of like my, you know, I share this checklist with authors, but it's also sort of the checklist I go through in my head when I first receive a piece. The second, and actually, Dr. Cooper talked about similar things for child development. So the second, and this one is actually probably the most common problem. Does the work bring a developmental lens to bear on the topic? Or what developmental lenses inform the work? What developmental considerations inform the work? And one thing that I think can happen is that an author can say, well, my work is about children, or you know, it's about children, and therefore CDP must be a good fit for it. But work can focus on children without being situated in frameworks that consider the specific physical, social, emotional, behavioral, or cognitive challenges and opportunities within a specific developmental range. So for example, adolescence or the preschool years, or maybe considering how changes in social, emotional, cognitive development across developmental time, across developmental periods might intersect with the topic. And so for work that incorporates a strong developmental framing may be appropriate for CDP. And when it doesn't incorporate a strong developmental framing, this is one of the areas that reviewers really, really push back. Maybe this is about children, but it's not about development. Where's the developmental framing? I can't tell you how many reviews, and even stuff that makes it past my desk and goes out to reviewers, and reviewers like, this is not strong enough of a developmental framing. And then the third thing that comes up in review in terms of missteps is, does the work adequately address SRCD's sociocultural policy and anti-racist statements? And I think folks in CDP, they think, how am I gonna implement this sociocultural policy? I don't have a method section. I don't have a sample, right? So when we're implementing it in empirical work, we're often thinking about, you know, describing our sample adequately. In CDP, this is about describing adequately and carefully who has been included and or who has been excluded from the work being reviewed. I'll pause there. Ting.
Well, thank you, Dr. White. I think we'll move on. That we will hopefully have some time to address some common questions across the journals. So next, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Ginger Moore. She is our interim editor of Monographs. Dr. Moore received her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh's Joint Program in Developmental and Clinical Psychology. She joined the faculty at the Penn State University, where her research studied development of emotion and ways in which early experiences and biology interact within high-risk contexts. She recently retired as an associate professor emerita, but we're very grateful to have her. Prior to joining the faculty at Penn State, she was an associate professor at Duke University and faculty affiliate at the UNC Chapel Hill. So let's hear from Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Ching. Monographs are somewhat unique among SRCD publications in that each issue is a very lengthy, extended work on a specialized topic. So manuscripts that are submitted are typically 150 to 250 pages. Because of this length, there's an opportunity to cover material in depth and discuss issues in a way that can't be accomplished in a typical journal article. Monographs are also written to reach a very broad audience, so they should be useful to subject matter experts, but also accessible to policymakers, educators, clinicians, journalists. I think many people think of monographs as an outlet for primarily large-scale, huge data set research. And it's true that monograph provides a great outlet for work like that, but it's also appropriate for projects that may have smaller samples or are extensive conceptual reviews. For example, in the past couple of years, Monographs published a cross-species study of joint attention that had a very small sample, a study of public engagement by urban youth that had a relatively small sample. And I think the best way for you to understand what type of work would best fit the scope and the format of monographs is to read monographs. Because there's such a variety of topics, and the approach can be very different for individual monographs, I think reading them gives you a good sense of that range. I think in general, Monographs always has and will continue to provide a very unique outlet for detailed, conceptually rich work that can reach a wide audience. So, Ching?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Moore. So can anybody submit to monographs, or does it have to be a team, a big team of researchers, or do you need to be invited to submit?
Okay. Writing a monograph is typically a major investment in time and effort. So it's usually, but not always, written by a team of authors. The team can include grad students and early career folks, though. In fact, the monograph coming out next, very soon, has 2 lead authors who are early career professors. The important thing to know about monographs, even when there is a team of authors, the monograph is written from a single voice. So it's a consistent tone and style. It's not a collection of edited chapters. Monographs has sometimes followed that format in the past, but the previous editor, Lynn Libben, instituted this vision, and I'm committed to carrying that on. So anybody can submit without first contacting the editor or being invited, but the editor more often works closely with authors, providing feedback and suggestions along the way, with the aim of supporting the potential for success. With such a large investment of time and effort in writing a monograph, we want to make sure that authors aren't spending a great deal of time and then, being terribly disappointed. So it's strongly recommended that authors first send an inquiry to the editor about the proposed topic and approach. The editor may have additional questions, and then may ask the authors to prepare a prospectus, a more detailed overview, an annotated table of contents. But remember, monographs are still peer-reviewed, and none of the steps that I just went over is required to submit. Ching?
Yes. So, one question, I personally kind of have about is like, monograph is such an atypical way of public, manuscript, unlike other journal, you submit manuscript, get rejected, you can submit to a different journal. So the format of monograph is really unique and it requires extensive time. So what's your suggestion for folks who, have an idea, potential idea for monograph, but what's the best way to develop that idea?
Again, as I said earlier, I think the best thing to learn what makes a good monograph or what would fit the scope and format of monographs is to read several issues, not just ones in your subject area, and in particular, read ones from the last 3 years that are represent the single voice format. It gives you a really good sense of the scope, the structure, how the writing can be accessible to both the general audience, but not talked down to those who are experts in the subject matter. And again, make use of the editor. I and previous editors, and I'm sure subsequent editors, are very happy to work with authors to help them decide if their idea is something that may be a good fit and could be developed for monographs.
Thank you. And then the other question is, I noticed that we have the Monograph Matters, which is a companion website for monographs. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, Monograph Matters was another innovation of Lynn Libben, and she established this web and media-based forum, which was designed to extend the impact, the utility, and the value of each monograph. So examples of the kinds of materials that end up on Monograph Matters include author videos or interviews. We work with authors to produce those. Links to data sets, coding systems, other kinds of measures or tools, different kinds of PowerPoints or materials that could be used in teaching. Invited commentaries, which have long been a part of monographs, are now included on the Monograph Matters website. So I encourage you to take a look at that website also, if you haven't already, to get a good idea of that. That's it for me.
Sorry. Let's move on. I would now like to introduce you to Dr. Lisa Berlin. She's the editor of Social Policy Report. Dr. Berlin is a professor at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and she brings expertise in infant caregiver attachment and programs and policies for families with young children, such as Early Head Start and the Federal Maternal Infant and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program. And she has published widely in top journals such as Child Development, Prevention Science, and Development and Psychopathology, and she has made invited contributions to numerous edited volumes. Her previous work with policymakers has included convening research colloquium for North Carolina state legislators and agency officials. She's a long-standing member of the editorial board of Attachment and Human Development. And Dr. Berlin has also co-edited several volumes and special issues of journals pertaining to attachment and family development. So let's hear from Dr. Berlin.
Thank you so much, Ching. I also just want to begin by acknowledging Associate Editor Jenny Owen, who in her principal job is Director of the North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnerships. That's an office of the state of the governor's office for the state of North Carolina that works a lot on cross-sector partnerships among researchers, practitioners, and policymakers in the state of North Carolina. And she's a great partner, editorial partner. We both started the first of this year. We have also recently appointed a diverse set of 12 editorial board members, and I look forward to getting their information up on that SRCD website soon. Ways in which the social policy report is is unique, or its specific characteristics include that it is a quarterly-ish journal published 3 to 4 times a year. And it has 2 overarching goals. One is to speak to policy-making audiences, to provide comprehensive, nonpartisan reviews of child development research findings to inform decision-making on policy questions. And second, more in line with, I think, the other journals, to inform SRCD members and other, members of the developmental science community about policy issues related to child development and child development research related to those issues. With respect to the SPR topics, they stem from both editorial board solicitations and cold proposals by authors. And in either case, we really welcome multi-author teams that include researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. Once a topic proposal is accepted, an author can proceed to submit a full manuscript for peer review. Some other points to note. The editorial board is in the process of revamping the requirements for topic proposals. And we're aiming to post these online within the next month. They are likely to require in a topic proposal a brief description of the policy question or questions to be addressed, along with anticipated policy recommendations or policy considerations. So really more explicitly centering the policy questions and considerations in the context of a review of relevant child development research. We, the editorial board, is also in the process of updating the manuscript submission guidelines, again, aiming to post those by the 1st of July. And again, they're likely to center policy considerations, policy recommendations. This is, I think, a little bit of a shift in that, for the most part, previously, social policy reports have consisted of research reviews followed by policy considerations and implications. So we're interested in considering flipping that. The current word limit for SPR submissions, excluding tables, figures, references, is 10,000 words. So that's approximately 40 double-spaced pages. But this may be reduced. This is something currently under consideration. Given again that my policy maker, government employee, associate editor tells me that no one in her line of work is going to read more than 10 pages, if we're lucky. So yeah, I'll stop there and take questions.
So in addition to the SPR topic proposal, will you also accept proposal for topics that the editorial board would consider soliciting manuscript proposals? If so, how would that process work?
Sure. So as I said, we will take topic proposals cold, and we will put out calls, solicitations for SPR topic proposals and or manuscripts. If someone wants to suggest a focus for a call or a topic that the editorial board would issue, a solicitation for, we're wide open to considering that. And that would be vetted by the editorial board or by a subset of us. And then we would go from there.
Thank you, Dr. Berlin. And now we have some time. I see there are many questions that folks have submitted, so I will try my best to feed the question to our editors. One question, as many of you mentioned the importance of developmental framing, for almost all SRCD journals. So could you please elaborate a little bit more on what is developmental framing?
Which one of us?
Maybe we should go in the order in which we spoke, unless you're asking one of us specifically.
So that means me, I'm first up. So, I think, my approach to thinking about developmental framing is really around describing the construct or constructs that are the area of focus for the paper. So thinking about it as a key in relation to being a child outcome of development, but also thinking about it as a developmental mechanism. So your developmental framing is around the theoretical perspectives, conceptual frameworks that are helping you to explain the potential impact or sort of the mechanistic pathway of that construct. And so I think it is up to the author or authors to really sort of think about what their approach will be. But I do think that the introduction theoretically and conceptually, so not just discussing the studies that have existed, but really sort of connecting that to sort of broader theoretical perspectives. Often that is the diversity of theoretical perspectives represented in the manuscript. And so you have flexibility, but I would suggest making sure your constructs are described in relation to existing theoretical and conceptual frameworks that help us, the audience, better understand the contribution of your paper, but also how this works within the broader discussion of the construct or constructs that you are focusing on.
So to add to what Dr. Cooper said, I'm going to say yes to all of that. And then I'm also going to say, so I'm going to give an example. Let's say, for example, you were studying second language acquisition and you wanted to talk about the development of gaining skills in a second language. If you submitted a review of that work to CDP and you did not specify the times and development that somebody was acquiring. So some people acquire a second language almost at the same time as their first language from the very earliest stages of language development. Other people develop a second language when they're in adolescence and they move to another country or adulthood or some other time. And so submitting a paper to CDP on second language acquisition without considering the times and opportunities and challenges that are encountered across developmental time or within a specific developmental time. Like maybe you want to talk about second language acquisition when people migrate to another country in early childhood or in adolescence. Or maybe you want to talk about second language acquisition across developmental time. But the point being that you are giving consideration to the factors that are going on either socially, emotionally, cognitively, all of them or only one or two of them, areas of development and how that's impacting your topic. I'm also going to draw from another question I see in the chat about for CDP, does it publish papers that affect, on policy, federal level safety net policy on child development outcomes, which may not investigate the specific mechanisms through which the policy affects child development? And I would say yes, but if you're talking about policy, just pick any policy, immigration policy, and you're saying this immigration policy affects kids or children, that would be inadequate for child development perspective. This immigration policy affects young children because what's happening at this young age, socially or cognitively or emotionally, is A, B, or C. Or this immigration policy affects children across developmental time because of these and here's how different aspects of development may be more or less salient and affected by that policy across time. Those are the types of developmental framing, we're hoping to see. I study neighborhoods. Does neighborhood matter for children, or do they matter for children at specific developmental times? Why do they matter more at this time versus later times versus maybe not so salient at other times? Those are the types of developmental framings we're looking for.
And Dr. Moore.
I don't have much to add to that. I just want to point out that, especially with strict word limits, page limits in journals these days, authors, I think, struggle with how to include a lot of that background and all the other information that they have to include. You don't got space in monographs, so that's not as much of a concern, but that means the expectation is even greater for monographs, that you're really expected to talk in depth about these issues.
Okay. Dr. Berlin, what about social policy?
I agree with everything that's said. I don't have anything to add. I think that was helpful elaboration.
Great. The other question, I see some, commonality is for authors who are like PhD students or, early career researchers, that it's always intimidating to submit your manuscript as the first author. The question I had is, will my identity as an, unestablished, researcher affect how my manuscript will be reviewed? Dr. Cooper, you want to start?
So I will say is that my short answer is no, in terms of the review. And in fact, I think, I feel this way, and most of us probably feel this way, is that that's important for early career scholars to be able to submit and have their work reviewed and be under consideration. I've handled papers as an associate editor that were led by students. I've handled papers as an editor that have been led by students. And so I think it really is a function of the contribution of the work. We can see for our own records who, is early career versus other stages, but it does not directly impact the review, whether it gets sent out for review or likelihood of desk rejection.
Anyone else would like to add?
I'll just add for monographs, because they're such big projects typically, there's still opportunities, as I think I mentioned in my overview, for grad students and early career folks. So I gave you the example of the monograph that's coming out soon, where the lead authors are assistant professors. Obviously, on the research team, there are more senior folks. There's a monograph in the works now. It hasn't yet been submitted, but the lead author on that is going to be a graduate student. The work is going to be based on the dissertation research, but again, with the support of a senior researcher. So there's definitely opportunities, and peer review is blind. So again, no one knows your status as, the editor, of course, knows that, but it's about the work. It's not about who did it.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And in some ways, I could see a social policy report being a really nice outlet for a dissertation or a piece of a dissertation that is cross-disciplinary. So yeah, it's about the quality of the product, and the team as a whole that is submitting the work.
I think the other more broader question is, you all mentioned how important is peer review, for our journals, and obviously we're at a time that that it's becoming increasingly difficult to get reviews back from to move the manuscript process along. So for researchers who want to become reviewers, how do they become reviewers at SRCD journals, and how do we learn how to write quality review, constructive reviews?
I will start, if continue with the ordering. And so, I think that there's various ways to encourage folks in terms of reviews. I will say is that for those of you who are interested in reviewing for child development, there is a link somewhere on the SRCD website. With that said, I received several emails for scholars who are interested in reviewing for our journal. And in fact, we're in the process of updating our database with Wally to make sure we have reviewers who are relatively so new to the field. So those who are earlier career postdocs, recent PhD doctoral graduates, and who are not yet in our database. So with that said, is that there are various ways to reach out, either to me directly or to sign up via the SRCD website. I think ensuring that folks get a review that is constructive. That is a large question that we probably can't answer in the time that we have. But I think that I certainly encourage reviewers in requests to think about broad questions in terms of contribution of the work for my statistical AEs. I often request that their expertise be focused on the methodology of the paper, so that we're getting a wide range in terms of review that gives us multiple layers in terms of assessing impact. So I say that part of that is really just the internal communication of what we hope to see in a constructive review. I think that is, that's just one example of how we continue to manage and navigate it in that respect.
Thanks, Dr. Cooper. So first of all, I just want to add that you can email cdp@srcd.org and say that you're interested in reviewing. It would really help me if you told me what your topical expertise was, what your developmental stage, what developmental age range expertise. So topical expertise might be like cognitive development or some specific aspect of cognitive development or social development or emotional development. Developmental stage might be infancy, childhood, adolescence. Do you have a particular contextual expertise like school context or immigration context? And do you have specific demographic expertise? Children with disabilities or social positionality expertise is also helpful here. Areas of the world expertise. So all those things are really helpful to me when matching up reviews, pieces that need to be reviewed with reviewer expertise. The other thing I want to say is when you give your reviews, being generative and engaged is really probably important to you when you receive a review, and is equally important to the authors of the work that you're reviewing and to the editor. I've received reviews that are like, I see no reason why this paper should be published. This is really hard for me to act on. I have no information, okay, because why? And so being generative is not about being only positive. Being generative is about saying, like, here are the real challenges of the work, or here's what's rubbing up against the work, or here's what's not considered, here's what's a fatal flaw. And so those are really important things for an editor, in particular when not all reviewers agree. So when somebody recommends reject and says, I see no reason why this work should be published, and somebody else recommends accept and really engages, as an editor, I'm really in a problematic zone of being like, I don't know why this person doesn't like the work, other than they just don't like it, and this person seems fairly pleased with the work. And so putting your critique in ways that not only the author can understand it, but in ways that an editor who has developmental expertise, but not maybe in this particular subdomain expertise, is really, really important for review. And then the last thing I want to encourage folks is when we're talking about language. So a lot of stuff that comes up in reviews is this stuff needs language editing. This is, this person needs somebody who is a first, English language, first language, or something like this. And I discourage folks from thinking about language editing in that way. Giving specific examples where editing can improve the writing is one way to think about that. And rather than focusing, like trying to keep issues of social positionality separate from science in reviews, I think is very, very important. If an issue of language editing is needed, recommending it somebody who speaks English as a first language is not the right recommendation, because not everybody who speaks English as a first language is a good writer or grammatically correct writer. And so thinking about your own social position when you review, and how social positionality factors like access to language, editing services, etc., those are social positionality factors. They're not science factors. So making sure that you're thinking about those issues when you're reviewing works is really helpful.
Okay, so I see that our webinar is coming to an end. The time goes by so fast, and thank you really for those of you who have submitted questions. If there are questions that the question didn't get to answer, feel free to reach out to the individual editors. They are very open, they are very responsive, and also, I just want to remind you there is a survey, quick survey at the end of the webinars, and we love your feedbacks. And I want to thank our editors, and also thank our SRCD staff, Melissa, Nate, and Suzanne, for making this webinar happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.